All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am here with the infamous Matt Money. He is also a host on the Palantir Weekly podcast. And I hit up Matt because I wanted to do a podcast, just us, no other brown guy taking up all the space. And well, I'm talking about Chris.
Well, yeah, what's wrong with that?
But no, just he's got to get out for this one. This one is just you and me, intimate candlelit dinner, speaking
After
alone
hours.
after hours, all about Palantir. So Matt, for those that don't know, works at an undisclosed oil company, and that company has been using Palantir. So Matt has a bit of a unique perspective on Palantir, given he has intimately used the product. He uses it on a daily basis, and he's able to understand kind of the trajectory of the company from a use case perspective. He might be wrong about the macro, right about the macro, but he does understand, like, hey, this is how it's used, and this is how I think other people could use it in the world, which is why I think his perspective is incredibly important. And also, he's been contributing to this community for like 2-3 years now. So happy to have you on, Matt. I guess I'll start off with the
Much
first
appreciated, man.
question before we get into the sort of deeper stuff. High level overview. When did you get into Palantir, and why is it something that you're so passionate about in terms of making content and contributing within an entire community?
So 6 years ago, I would say, is probably when I first got introduced to Foundry specifically. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of applications, right? It was very bare bones. And I'm not sure if that's just how Palantir kind of just got bootstrapped into the commercial space, because I think we were one of the first few clients that Palantir kind of got working with. And so things changed. Like, we were using certain applications and they changed. So that was a little bit frustrating because, they're building it on the fly. But anyway, I had never had an experience like that before, where uh, a group of software engineers would sit you in a room and say, okay, just use the product as if you were to be trying to solve problems on a day-to-day basis. Bring into the room for the next 2 hours something that you want to accomplish, and see if you could accomplish it using this software. And so then we were trying to like struggle through and kind of build things. And then if they saw us kind of like sitting stagnant, they're like, why are you stagnant? What can we help with? What can we do? And so this kind of iterative process kind of happened for a week or two, where we would get into the room and trial it out. And it was like, what the heck is kind of going on here? And then I had like these interviews with the 4 development engineers, and I would just sit there and I'd be like expecting, I guess, more hands-on love and like, this is how you use the product. And they were just like, set up straight up. The meeting started with, what are your problems day to day?
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I never really thought about that. I'm like, well, this is like, no. Like, what are your problems? And I'd be like, okay, this. No. Like, what can't you do? Like, what if you could, in the simplest form, like, what are you trying to do, and how are you getting problems to get to that answer as quickly as possible? And it was like almost as if they were trying to teach you how to walk again,
Mm.
of like trying to get you from point A to point B as quick as possible. And so it was unlike that 6 months to a year was unlike anything I've ever experienced, in terms of being able to, I guess, kickstart a process or be able to be involved in software creation. And I've been handed software, dozens of times. There's always, every 2 to 3 years, there's a new software, it's a new license we need to use, or there's a new, product that we need to use for this or that. And that was the most unique experience. And so I remember promising those guys, I was like, this is unlike anything I've ever done before. Nobody's ever really sat down, like nobody that creates, they're like, how can we make this like easier for you, more efficient, however, and get you to think in a way of data is paramount, and then what you're doing is really just trying to get from point A to point B, rather than, this is the process, you have to follow the process. It's like, that's been done for over 50 to 100 years, and it's just evolved slowly over time. It's like, no, erase everything you've ever known, point A to point B, how can we get you there as fast as possible? And it's like, okay, cool. And once I kind of realized and was shaped by that culture aspect of data and data first, I was like, if this company ever goes public, I'm buying into it. And
Mm.
and that was like where I really was like, this is unique. I've been using Microsoft products forever. I've been using Apple products forever. And never have I had Apple or Microsoft sit me down and say, how can we make your life more efficient? Like, how can we get you from point A to point B faster? Except if you're using Google Maps or something, but that's a different story.
Was there a culture shock in your organization when these forward deployed engineers came in and really tried to teach you how to walk again? Was there a lot of resistance towards that, or was there more acceptance?
Uh, I would say it was 50-50, right? It wasn't like, oh, these guys don't know what they're talking about, but it was like, I think the fear was is they were giving up a lot of control to an extent. Like you had to basically say, hey, their culture's coming in to help right size our ship and move us in a certain direction and get rid of some of those old cobwebs that have been growing since, the early 1900s. Um, and so, you're kind of taking prehistoric systems that have been slightly altered and changed. One step will change here, another step will change there. And you're kind of saying, let's go from the ground up, reestablish everything from ground zero. And how would you do it then? And how would you make it most efficient? And also think about it from a computer and data engineering perspective rather than specifically petroleum engineering or reservoir engineering or geology or geophysics sort of perspective. And that was good and bad, right? Because you have, as always, with if you're making progress in any organization, you're always going to have normal culture clashes, right? We have it even just a normal spirited debates amongst our own internal engineers. Somebody has a different perspective about X, Y, or Z, and they might be less experienced or more experienced, or and so everyone has their kind of thought process, and there's generally speaking no one way answer. I think the big difference between the two organizations was one came from like a very, I don't want to say hands-on ish perspective, but this is the way we're doing things for 100 years. How are you wrong? Versus, hey, you're thinking about it from a data perspective. And honestly made me think like, why couldn't Google come in and run our company and be able to do it well? Or why wouldn't anybody that also has like a very good data analytics perspective or a way to manipulate data from a software engineering perspective come in and be able to run our company? And I think that was pretty scary for people to be like, is this, are we getting sold? Are we getting bought? What is this? It's like, no, we're just partnering with Palantir. And that was a nice, refreshing sort of change. But
Did
there
you
was
ever
some,
go ahead, finish the last sentence?
there was some, yeah, there was a lot of, I guess, headbutting, but I think eventually we would give and take, right?
Did you ever feel, just piggybacking off that they were going to replace your job? Did you ever feel an existential threat, or did you ever feel they're just trying to help us?
No, I always felt in control. So I mean, while they were simplifying things, it was like I was the one still clicking the buttons. I was the one still kind of putting up the guide rails to get from point A to point B. And I'm still the one attending the meetings. I'm still the one that's, still the brain that's operating everything. And it's like using a fancier calculator.
Right.
It's you're not ever going to be replaced. I think it's just the efficiencies in your usage is going to be more efficient and more valuable, right? It's like going from a calculator to then using Microsoft operating system to now being in this operating system specifically focused around data. It's going to be a lot more efficient and focused comparatively to the computers or the operating systems that we used in the 90s and the early 2000s and 10 years ago.
So the way I'm understanding your kind of intimate use with the product is it's almost like data as a service. So at I guess a high level, and then you can get as granular as you want.
Yeah.
The way you're using Foundry and the way you're using Palantir as a service to optimize or kind of mobilize your data in order to make you more productive. What is the use case of that? What is the value proposition of that? Can you speak to this concept of this word ontology we keep hearing? Can you give us kind of a 5-7 minute diatribe on how using data as a service within Foundry in particular actually increases the revenue for the company you work at and may decrease the cost, increase the efficiency, et cetera?
I think the one thing that the thing that I like to think of Foundry as most, which I think is going to get me scolded by somebody that's actually very technical and knows how to use it, is like, it's almost like when you're entering something, everything's interconnected, right? So when you use Excel doesn't always talk to PowerPoint, or Excel doesn't always talk to Word or anything like that. The beauty of a Foundry is you have all those things that are interconnected. So I can create reports, and people are like, "Oh, Power BI does that and stuff of the like." It's like, I get it, but you have reports and things of the like that you can create that have visualizations that you can send out to a multitude of different people, that you can put a different allowance on in some certain cases depending on security. And I think that that's just brilliant, right? You have all this now, things that communicate very well with each other, that is almost seamless. It's almost like everything is loaded to one centralized database that communicates with each other, versus if you have a bunch of people in Excel, they could upload it to SharePoint, but that SharePoint's not going to be immediately accessing the Word document or the PowerPoint presentation and what have you. So it brings that to the next step of being able to integrate all those different minor applications all in one. And then two, the ontology piece is very important, because even if you are using an Excel or something that is trying to categorize data, the ontology piece is taking specific numbers and trying to relate it back to certain different things. Like you have a very small, let's just say, stream of data, and it's like, well, that data might not necessarily be in a great relationship with that data. So it's all just about categorization. And so, for example, if you have a facility name, we have, say, 30, 40 big assets within our organization. It's like if you were to look at assets within the organization, you'd say these 40 different names. Well, it's like there's subset of data underneath all those 40 names, but if you were just in Excel, you couldn't really categorize things very well in terms of like a model library, or being able to understand what data and how it correlates, what's the parent, what's the son, what's the grandfather of all these different categories of data. And then underneath that, it's like, well, we operate in regions, right? I work in the Gulf of Mexico. Some people might work in the UK. Some people might work in the Southeast Asian markets. And so having that ability to subset all this data and have it consistent across an entire organization. It's not just somebody in, say, the Gulf of Mexico opening up a Microsoft Excel and saying, okay, here's all the different categories. It's like, nope, now it's actually uploaded to one central database that the entire company has the ability to use. And then it can, that might not seem so useful. There are things that then, like Fusion is a really good application within Foundry that basically says, I only want to focus on these particular things. And so you have this big spreadsheet worth of data that's probably collecting millions of data points a day, but I only want to focus on these two things. And so while that other spreadsheet is working on in the background, Fusion will only allow you to focus on and kind of categorize. It's like a big pivot table, but it allows you to, if anybody's used pivot tables in Excel, they're great, but at the same time, they kind of break anytime you add new data to the data set. And so Fusion is like this version that won't break, right? It's always constantly being updated. And so you're focusing on specifically the things that you want, which is beautiful. And then there's the aspect of adding an additional layer, which is, as I've kind of alluded to, you've already had all these model libraries, categorization, this ontology being built from day one as of 6 years ago. Now you're getting to the point where, you're probably sitting there, it's like, why does this ontology really matter? And it's like, well, then you start to add in the large language models and things like that on top with the AI, where it's like, oh shit, now you could put up the guide rails to say, what is our best operating asset? How does it work? Why is it most efficient? And truly start to use AI to the purpose that would be something that, I don't know, it's still very much in its infancy, but there's a lot of different applications of why it might be useful. Say a piece of equipment goes down on one of our assets in the Gulf of Mexico, we could say, well, it might have a long lead of 24 to 36 months. We have a lot of activity ramping up across the industry right now because oil prices last year hit $140 a barrel. And so a good example of this is now a lot of people are starting to invest again, billions of dollars, and lead times are getting longer for trees and pipe, and sourcing for those things can take years, if not, 2-3 years. And so it's like, do we have any excess, say a valve breaks or a gauge breaks or a pump breaks? You could look and say, do we have any, from an AI perspective, AIP perspective, do we have any of this additional part on any of our other assets before we have to go to the market and wait 2 years, 3 years? And that could be sourced from, another Gulf of Mexico entity by, maybe a week or two, depending on, how easily it can be moved, and that could have huge pieces instead of calling a bunch of different people, be like, can you look this
That's what I
up?
was going to say. If you didn't have AIP, what would you have to do to get that answer?
I'm sure you'd have to call and like call a regional president or local president, like our asset manager might have to call somebody in the UK, and the UK is like, okay, let me talk to my engineers. And so it's like, if you have everything from day one categorized appropriately, then you could say, let's look up this particular part and see if we have any excess or spares. Because there's certain things that break all the time, and we always have spares. And there's certain things that are rare that break. So it's, if you have a categorization and like a true library of all these things that are on your facilities, whether it's a digital twin aspect of things or whether it's just a simple not Excel workbook, but just a Foundry workbook that has all these things categorized that you can search for, and it's all connected to one simple database. It just makes things a lot easier from being able to go from one region to the next. And also it standardizes things. We used to have to go from one region to the next. We were using different softwares, and I remember moving from from Gulf of Mexico to Trinidad for a year when I was working there, and I was like, oh, you guys don't have these like simple, like it was still new in the company, right? So it wasn't like we'd been around for Palantir had been around for 5 years in the organization. But it was like, okay, I know exactly what I need to do to be able to build a model of our wellbore in Foundry and Quiver to be able to monitor all these things. And then every day I would send a report to the boss, who was probably curious about what rate production was for the previous day. And you could see, well, what did we actually sell versus what the meters said we sold. So you could see, if the meters were off by 5-10% or what have you, because that happens as well. And so it allowed them to be able to keep a monitor on things. So you'd wake up 8 a.m. every morning, and our days from 5 to 5 a.m. to 5 a.m. And so you'd wake up in the morning, you're like, okay, 3 hours ago, we know this is what we posted for the oil rate production for the day, or in Trinidad, the gas rate production. You could be like, okay, things are good. And if things weren't good, you'd be like, well, shit, what happened, right? Why is it down 5-10% for the day? So it allows you to start, instead of having to go and dig up all these things, look well by well. It gives you a summation, a report, and it just makes things a little bit easier. Anyway.
Can you speak a little bit to, and I know your organization hasn't fully implemented AIP yet, but you mentioned the LLMs that Palantir is trying to help build with AI infrastructure into an organization. It connects with the concept of an ontology because of guardrails. Can you speak to that? What does guardrails have to do with the sort of common foundation of truth, which is the ontology, and how does that actually accelerate the implementation of LLMs into a company in a more efficient way? Like, why do they need the ontology that they've been working on for 20 years to be able to get to this AIP platform?
Because you need to understand what relationships are related to what different pieces of data, right? So if you're like, what's asset, if you just use it in simple terms, what's asset name? Asset name might be 30, 40 different wells that tie back to one facility. And so if you ask AIP and you're like, what is asset name's performance for yesterday? That's not going to go and tell you the well number one made 30,000 barrels a day. It's going to tell you wells 1 through 40 on this particular asset made 30,000 barrels or 40,000 barrels.
Right.
And you could say, what is our best performing asset today? That is nice, but we don't own 100% of all the assets, right? We go into partnership with other super majors or other small companies to help eliminate risk or at least shield yourself from capital exposure against risks and uncertainties, right? I mean, it helps if you kind of have 50% of two assets than 100% of one, because if one goes down, it's that whole diversification aspect of things. So it'll allow you to kind of be like, well, do you care about the gross number or do you care about the net number to undisclosed oil company, right? Because, obviously we also have to pay royalties to the government, and, we have to pay 12.5 to 18.75% of every barrel that we produce to the government in the Gulf of Mexico. So it all just depends on what you're doing. If you just ask a simple question, it's going to give you a very broad answer back, right? So those guardrails, if you don't have the right sort of models set in place, it'll just gave you back gobbledygook. And so the ontology is important because if you classification of your data is appropriate, then whatever you get from AIP is hopefully after some time and some iteration going to be a lot better and a lot more useful, and it's going to make things a lot quicker. Now, it's not going to be day one sort of implementation, but I'm assuming after 6 months of trial, error, and I'm sure there's always going to be mistakes, but I think after some time, after 2 to 3 years, once you've guardrailed it enough and built the connections as you would expect, and the keywords, right, as well. Like you have to think some keywords or some questions might be related to some pieces of data versus others. So if you're talking about CPM, for example, on your Google YouTube page, it's not going to be looking
impressions.
Yeah, it's not going to be looking at your Twitter feed, is it? Like,
No.
so it's like you have to think how each one of those pieces of questions and the keywords are going to be associated with particular categories within your ontology. That truly will make it impactful. It also will help, if you do it appropriately, speed up your engines, right? Because at the same time, if you have a keyword related to more particular items than it needs to be, then it's going to take longer to compute. And if it takes longer to compute, it's going to be more expensive for you to keep running that sort of system, right? Because it has to work harder, and you're getting charged for that particular usage case. So you have to think, it actually kind of goes back to what Snowflake was talking about. Like, depending on the data set, if you shrink it and you have it more appropriately lined up, you're actually going to make your engines way quicker. And so that's why some of their revenue is being lost, because they're trying to make things more efficient. It's the same sort of concept, right? If you don't have it set up appropriately, it's going to take longer. It's not going to be as efficient. But yeah, anyway, hopefully it makes sense. Hopefully I'm making it as generic as possible. I don't want to get too technical on it.
Right. The relational databases between any types of assets within an organization have to be formed, have to be understood, have to be optimized. Like, I mean, the keyword analogy is perfect on Google. Like, if you type in Palantir, there is a certain number of creators that are going to pop up because YouTube's algorithms have optimized that keyword to show certain search results because they believe that's the content that people should watch. Mm-hmm. Same thing I would imagine in an organization, and that has to be formed over some time within an ontology for AIP to even have any use case to be able to then give results to people when they type in things into the LLM. Now this seems transformational. This obviously seems like something that could completely transform a business and be able to take it to the next level. You've been on record comparing Palantir's potential trajectory of growth to another company that has made shareholders a lot of return on their capital, which is Amazon and their AWS product. I want to give you some time to kind of explain, what do you see as the similarity between an AWS and an AIP/Foundry that could result in that crazy amounts of billions of revenue with 80% margins per year over the next couple decades?
Well, I think a lot of people, like, if you take AWS, for example, and granted, I was probably barely out of diapers. No, I'm just kidding. I was probably just out of middle school going into high school when AWS was really starting getting kicked off. I think it was 2006 timeframe. So I was just like a freshman in high school, I believe. And so I remember hearing rumblings about it, probably not 2006, but definitely when I was in high school going into college, about AWS. And I think a lot of people were like, well, why would I need to run anything off AWS? I could just make it myself. And I don't think people fully understood the impact of cloud computing and things of the like at that point in particular. And so then you started to slowly see that transformation of people going from pure desktop and keeping everything at home, multiple hard drives. Oh, my hard drive died. I need to go to the store, Micro Center or whatever, and get a backup external hard drive so I can unplug it and, I don't get viruses, what have you. So I think people started to truly understand the capability of running websites and running things off of AWS and started to truly kickstart that sort of growth. But I don't think in 2000s or even 2005 or probably even through 2010, people realized that was something that they would need, right? And it was something that was there 5-10 years ahead of when people actually thought that they needed it. And we've seen how great of a trajectory that AWS has had. And now people use it more and more every day. And it's truly revolutionized how we do business, globally, for multitude of different companies using it. Like, literally, it's a global piece of infrastructure that I don't think people even knew we needed 15 years ago. So people were probably like, well, I can make my website, I know HTML, I can create it, and I can store all that in a server in my house, and it's not going to be that big of a deal, to the point where we are today, where it's you just work with AWS and pay for it as you go and the usage that you need. And it's kind of a genius sort of strategy. I think it's the same thing. People are like, well, I have Microsoft Teams, like, or I have Microsoft operating system. Like, why do I need a different operating system to store my data, use data analytics? There's Power BI, there's Spotfire, there's a bunch of different things that you can use to kind of get it. And it's like, well, I don't think like those are tools that have been patched to work off of the old mindset, right? So just like I was talking about with my analogy of getting the cobwebs off of 100-year-old processes, we've been using these Microsoft OS sort of processes now for 20 years, 20, 30 years now. And it's like, there has to be a better way. If you invent it from the ground up, what would you do? And it might not necessarily be important for everybody, but if you're a data run or data physical organization where the data is truly going to impact the day-to-day decisions that you have, you're not like I can't say that because I feel like that's still, I was gonna say you're not a customer service related industry. It's like customer service is still important because there's data points on customers that you need to gather every day to make sure that their feelings or not feelings, but their needs are met, or their feelings, I guess, are met in appropriate manner. But it's putting data first in a way that it hasn't been done on a Microsoft or Apple operating system, iOS. And it's the same thing if you think about it. Maybe this is a good example. If you were to be doing video editing, making music, what operating system would you use? Would you use a Mac or would you use a Windows?
Most people would use a Mac.
So if you're focusing on data,
right,
I think that you're probably going to make the correlation of people don't know it yet, but you'll probably want to use something like a Foundry or a Gotham. And so it's just a different way. It's not to say it's the right way, right? If you were to use video games or like, hey, I'm going to play Diablo, you wouldn't open up a Foundry instance to play Diablo or play Call of Duty, or you'd probably get on a Microsoft operating system or a Windows computer and just play, right? So right. I think that it's not to say it's the right answer for everybody, but I think it's what people don't realize they need yet. And it's something that I think we've patched over time, which is using a Microsoft operating system, which is meant to be used for everybody, right? Anybody can open it up. They can use calculator, or they can play video games, or they can go on the internet, and so that's not the use of a Palantir Foundry instance, at least not yet. Maybe they come out with the consumer things where you play internet or play video games on a Palantir sort of software. I don't see it as of yet, but this is something that is specifically focused on making enterprises the most efficient that they can be, focused around data and decision making. And
why is that comparable to an AWS over the long term? Why do you think? Because AWS is cloud computing, you need to host your data.
For sure, center. It's apples and oranges, for sure. It's a comparison, but the growth aspect is not, right? So I think the thing where maybe people are like, AWS and Foundry are completely different. It's like, I understand that the products themselves are completely different. They do have both cloud aspects to them, but that's not the comparison I'm trying to make. The comparison I'm trying to make is the growth trajectory for the organizations themselves. I think a lot of people don't understand what AWS was back then, and it got to $1 billion, $2 billion worth of revenue within 5-6 years. And then it took off to the point where I think it's making $80 billion a year in revenue. And I'm trying to compare that to what Palantir really is. People are just coming into Palantir is really only a 5-6 year. Sorry, Foundry and Gotham are really only a 5-6 year journey of actually trying to physically sell to the commercial customer. They've been honing in on their strategy over the past 20 years. They've been around since 2003, but they were focused on making themselves invaluable to the government and things of the like. And once they really finally, I guess, turned over the leaf and said, you know what, I think we have the product that we need to go to commercial, then they started it. And I think it's been slow, but you know, to get to that point. But now that I think you've gotten there over the past 6 years, going from, I forget what they went public at, but I think it was less than like $1 billion in revenue to go
Yeah,
from a billion
about 800
to
million, something like that.
yeah, something. So that was just when they went public in 2020. So yeah, I mean, it's starting to go pretty quick if you think about it in that perspective. Like I was just doing some analysis of how quickly their revenue was growing, and I think in like 2018, 2019, they were still in $200 million revenue quarters.
Yeah.
And so the fact that now we're talking about getting to $600 million revenue quarters and growing, and releasing new products that, I think that's the other piece is AIP is probably the first of many products that will continue to release. If you think and you look at those presentations that they've had, they had the one for Gotham that they started at kind of 2016 or 2017, and they have all the additional capabilities that they've added to Gotham since then. They had Foundry, which was kind of like 2018 or 2019, and all the capabilities they've had since then. They had Apollo, which started in 2020 or 2021. All the capabilities they've added since then. They are just releasing AIP, which is just at the moment what it is today, and who knows what capabilities they're going to be adding. The thing that's beautiful is that a lot of times all these different applications talk well with each other. And that's something that I think people don't acknowledge. It's like Foundry, it's like you have all these applications. All these applications are based off of an operating system of data that you have that are all kind of intercommunicated. And then same thing with Apollo. Apollo's helping deploy specific versions of software or rights to people within an organization. I think that's genius as well. And the fact that, you kind of have it on a web instance like Google Chrome, it allows you to kind of do it without needing to, I guess, having to restart a computer or anything like that, right? Because it's kind of uploaded and done through an instance on Google Chrome rather than, you're not opening up a Palantir laptop like you do like a Windows, right? You open up a Windows laptop and enter an instance on Google Chrome. And so that means it's kind of all uploaded through the internet, which is pretty interesting. And you can kind of take that kind of wherever you need to be. Anyway.
So I know you work in the commercial sector with the software. I want to get your high level overview because you mentioned it as an investor and how you analyze the government business. They just got $100 million in 3 contracts, sole sourced, meaning there was no competition for those contracts. How big do you think the government business can be with defense budgets in the United States growing every year? And is that a part of the business that gets you excited as an investor ultimately?
Well, I think the TAM of looking specifically total addressable market, I mean, looking specifically only at the US market is underselling the government business. But I'd say I could easily see within the next 10, 20 years it getting to, I don't know, it's $1 billion ish now. I could easily say getting it to 8 to 10 billion just for the US.
Right.
Which would probably be close to today's budget. Of course, it'll probably grow, but I can easily say getting to about a 1% or more share of that total spend. And I'm sure if you looked at what Microsoft gets, it's probably way more than even that. So it's just my thoughts there. But I think that you're underselling potentially we've seen the contracts come through the UK as well, and obviously the Ukraine deal that's going on with rebuilding Ukraine and how they're going to use that. And so I think 8 to 10 billion is probably where I'd say the US government business. I'm not 100%. I'll just be blank and caveat that, or sorry, blunt, as I like to say, and caveat that with I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if it gets to 1%.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, if we think defense spending is growing, especially internationally, we see, from a philosophical sense, the whole deglobalization of society, Russia, what's going on, potentially China, Taiwan. It makes sense to imagine that more institutions would want to at least have software, even if nothing's going wrong, just in case something does go wrong. And Palantir will be first on the list. Let me throw you an a off ball here. How do you feel about Alex Karp as the CEO of the company?
Love it.
Do you feel his eccentricities add to the downside of the stock? Meaning, do you think investors don't like some of the quirks he has, and that is ultimately not good for shareholders in the short term or long term? Or do you think some of those quirks actually add to the mystique of the company, which make it an exciting, like he's not a Frank Slootman. He's not a typical operator.
Yeah, I think Karp is the person that you need for Palantir today. If you need somebody that um how do I put this? I think that from an image perspective, it has hampered the speed at which Palantir could have been loved and adopted by Wall Street. But to me, that doesn't matter because I know in the long term, the products are going to truly be the thing that outshine. And I think Karp is the right person to get the products and the philosophy and the culture of the company in the way and manner that it has been kind of cultured to get to a place where it can be that generational transformational company. I think if you had somebody like a Slootman, you would have focused specifically on Foundry and Gotham. You probably wouldn't have been able to create something like an AIP. I don't think you would have been able to create something like an Apollo. I don't think that I think that you probably would get sales way faster if you had Slootman at the head of something. But would you have the longevity and the runway and ability to continue to innovate and add additional features to the product is kind of my fear. And so there's a give and take balance with all these things of truly listening and being philosophical about what's truly important, which is what can we do to make enterprises the most efficient and truly drive value for those organizations. And then you have somebody like a Slootman or somebody that's specifically focused only on sales, which is great if you're a mature business. But a company that's still truly in its infancy needs somebody like uh, a Jobs, a Karp, somebody that is very philosophical in manner to be like, no, this is why we're here. This is what the customer needs. This is what, that you're fighting for the customer versus you're both fighting for the customer, but in different ways, right? I think Karp is fighting for the customer to make sure that they get the value that they need, versus a Slootman is fighting for the customer in terms of fighting to get them to purchase things from the company. And so I think right now, with where Foundry is, you need the former rather than the latter, and you need people to continue to talk to you, form those relationships, because at the end of the day, the customers, the enterprises are going to tell you what they need. And if you're just trying to sell them something, then they're going to borrow gobbledygook, and it's going to be the same. Not borrow, but buy gobbledygook, and in 3 to 5 years, another salesman's going to come along and steal them, right? For their product. So,
speaking of Karp as a CEO, I want to get your take on his very controversial statement that was music to our ears as shareholders, maybe not music to other shareholders' ears, which is we don't have a pricing strategy for artificial intelligence. We are just going to capture the whole market. What is your kind of raw thoughts when the CEO of a company you're heavily invested in says that?
Well, I know it got me fired up. I know it didn't fired up in a positive manner. I know it didn't get people fired up in the same way as I was. They were fired up in the what the hell sort of manner. So I think that AIP, just like Foundry, just like Gotham, just like Apollo, is going to have very different use cases. And it really honestly depends on what you're going to use it for. And if you're doing it for something that's very simple, you're probably not going to be a very big customer. But something like what I could potentially see AIP being with an undisclosed oil company, I foresee something like that being huge. The amount of times that when we're coming up with a project proposal or something like that, a commercial analyst on our finance team will ask me something rather simple. And a lot of times it's because, one, they probably don't even have access to Foundry because they don't need it at the moment. And then two, it's because it requires a little bit of accuracy. I look at that things every day. They look at the commercial operating plans and the costs and the OpEx and the CapEx of things that are going on. And so I wouldn't be able to pull up the data. I'd have to ask them, right? So if you have the right tools that can access and have been set up by your teams to say, hey, Matt, how much is this well made? We're writing it into a financial memorandum, and we need to know so that we can give context appropriately for the executive signing. Then you don't need to bother me, and it allows me to focus on and continue to focus on things that are adding value to the organization rather than regurgitating information that I can find or they could find if they had the right ability to. And so that adds a whole new department of people that would have access to Foundry or to AIP or something like that, which hasn't been used before. Now, it also depends on really just the use cases, right? I mean, some people might not really care about AIP, or they're just trying it out. Or another piece of it that I think a lot of people don't recognize, and I think this is still the case with Gotham and Foundry today, is there's going to be some industries that are now excited because they want to get out on the AI train that haven't been involved before. And so you give it to them for free to lock them in, one, to learn about that particular industry, so that if you ever go to a different industry in the future, now you have the ability to kind of upsell them on different products, whether it's aeronauticals or energy or what have you. But I think it's something that it's a long-term game. You capture as much of the market share as you can. Who care if they're a profitable company? This, I'm going to say this, and hopefully this makes sense. They're a profitable company that now no longer needs the free cash flow to be able to survive because they have 2 point some billion dollars in the bank. They're a profitable company now where they're continue to add to that cash in the bank. They don't have debt. What's the easiest way to get market share ownership if you're not selling it for a price at all? If you're able to give it to as many people for as cheaply as you can, take the entire market, right? Get them into the infrastructure, because once you get onto Foundry and once you get onto Gotham, it's very hard. It's very sticky. So the true value is getting as much market share as possible. You get the customer count up, and just as we've seen, customers generally stay. The net dollar retention is generally, it might be small, 10, 20% a year, but if you give it to as many people as possible, you capture the market before anybody else does, before they get involved with Snowflake or anything like that. I mean, you're talking about a go-to-market strategy. What better strategy is that than to get them on the hook and then slowly say, well, we're actually going to have to start charging you this year a little bit.
And the sales is kind of easy then, because you're like, hey, it's free. And who doesn't like free? Right? And free after 18 months, then it's like a couple $100 million, and you're like, well, it's worth it.
And I think you'd be surprised if you listen to a lot of the talks that Karp gives. I think you'd be surprised at some of the clientele that he mentions, and I have a feeling that way more people have this software in their hands that's for free than you would probably give credit to or think. There's a lot of charities that have probably got it. There's a lot, and some of it might just be the philanthropic nature, but I think a lot of it is truly the aerial exposure, market share exposure aspect of things. And eventually they're going to turn on the drip. And I think there's a lot more companies that are in the, hey, let's invest in these companies, get them as partners, and then truly slowly move them to the expand and scale phase over time. And I think that is what Karp knows that a lot of people don't, is how free he's given it away. I'm sure he didn't charge for the COVID, the pandemic aspect of, being, and I know plenty of people, like my brother-in-law works for a company, and I'm like, hey, just curious, do you guys use Palantir at all? He's like, you mean the company that we use to input all of our like pandemic numbers into and vaccine numbers and stuff into? I was like, that's the only thing you guys are using it for? He's like, yeah, I think we're gonna get rid of it like in a couple months. But I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually turned around and tried to potentially get their foot in the door in that particular organization. But think about how many different organizations they got their foot into. That was the database worldwide. So you don't think about it. It's like, I'm sure that the amount of clientels that they got, and same thing with Ukraine, right? A lot of people probably like, I don't know anything about Palantir. Weren't they the people that helped with the pandemic? Now they're in Ukraine. What's going on with that?
Right.
So it's that piece where you're continuing to build that rapport with the Western world to recognize these guys are on our side, huh? They're helping you through Ukraine. They're helping with the pandemic. These guys must be on our side. Must be a pretty good company. So I think that you haven't heard the last of it for sure. I honestly think that it's very much in its infancy, and that's kind of where I think the AWS analogy comes in. It's like a lot of people didn't really know about it, but you keep hearing about it, and you still don't really know what the hell it does. But eventually, it's going to catch on like wildfire in your entire company, if not the entire infrastructure of most enterprises in the U.S. if they're big enough, right, and they're focused enough around data and stuff of the like. Will be running off of Palantir. I'm very convinced that huge market share of a lot of these companies in the next 20 years.
There are people that say Palantir is an evil company, they exploit data, and that there are major ethical issues with investing or even using their products. How did you reconcile those ethical concerns when you invested in 2020, and do you still share any of those ethical concerns today?
Between now and 2020, sorry, when I invested in 2020, I wouldn't say I really had a very strong opinion about it. I knew that they're pretty good about making sure that the data privacy and people didn't have access. Like I don't have access to a lot of our other regions' data, if that makes sense. I have access to the Gulf of Mexico. I have access to Trinidad data. Places that I've worked, I actually haven't really checked the Trinidad data. I could check the reports and stuff that I've made that I have access to, but if I were to go to specific files, I don't know if I still have access to them or not. Um, Certain applications I can access the data, certain applications I cannot. So that kind of goes back to that. But I remember having the other day, actually it's probably 6 months ago now. So to answer your question, when I invested in 2020, I didn't really think about it. Now, 6 months after this whole NHS conversation has kind of got started about, they're trying to kill us. Basically, they're trying to use our data. Evil spy company, what have you. I remember hearing somebody complaining with one of the other engineers, why can't we just have a generic account? Why can't we just have a generic account for Palantir so that anybody can access this or access that? And I remember them picking up the phone and talking to the guy on Palantir. He's like, it's not how we do it. Why would you want a generic account? Right? If you have a generic account, that means that it's not tied to one person, right? Anybody can access it. Who knows who's accessing it? It's not bueno. It doesn't go with the ethical considerations of what Palantir is all about.
Right.
They want to have an account attached to an entity or a person like myself, so they could say, "Hey, Matt accessed the data. Why is Matt accessing this data?
Right.
Matt shouldn't have access to this data. Turn it off."
Right.
And I've heard people talk to like, "Oh, I left this team or I left the region and I thought I still had access to Palantir and I tried going in and I couldn't access the database." That was within days. Like, it's pretty impressive how quickly they'll be able to turn on and off data. And so in that respect, it kind of gives me concern, like the consideration of, hey, they are actually thinking about these things more than people really give credit for. And I'm sure if it was a true concern, like how HIPAA and things like that within the hospitals, I'm sure it's very well done. I don't think that we have some confidential information with an undisclosed oil company, but I mean, we're not talking about people's social security numbers and stuff like that. We're talking about barrels of oil that came out of a well, right? I mean, it's really not that confidential at the end of the day. If like somebody found out, they'd probably be more impressed or think that that's pretty cool rather than like, oh, how can I use this to take down undisclosed oil company from a hacking perspective? That stuff still goes on, right? Everyone tries to hack everybody, but like, it's not like you can ruin somebody's true life. We're not giving out social security numbers and stuff of the like. I would love to get my fingers on, or at least see the sort of, I don't want to, I'm going to say firewalls. I know it's not the right way, but layers and barriers that they have in place for what they're doing at like Cardinal Health. And who were the gentlemen that presented at AIPCon?
Cleveland Clinic.
Yeah, I would love to see how they are managing that. And maybe that's something, because we have somewhat of an influence, maybe not as much as we do, or maybe we have more than we think we do. We reach out to Sham, or we reach out to some of these guys on Twitter, or just even through this interview. If you're watching this, I would love to see that at a FoundryCon or an AIPCon, the layers of security and how that's being implemented. And I think Apollo has a big piece in that, because I think that's truly trying to understand who's getting the right software, who's getting the right access to data, who's getting. And so I'm really curious, and I would love to see more about it. And if somebody knows of something, I'd love to see that in the comment section below. Please tag me in it.
All right. This has
Could
been
be a great
great.
video.
This
Yeah.
has been great. My last question for you, Matt. I know you talked about it a little bit yesterday, but because this is your exclusive, I want to give you a chance to put some airtime on it. You're a big guy in the community. A lot of people follow you. A lot of people care about the stuff you say, especially the stuff you tweet. And you have recently tweeted a lot this 3-word phrase, Palantir 2.0. So for everyone that's wondering, that's so confused, like this guy sounds pretty bullish. What he thinks the stock's gonna go to $0? What's going on? Why do you say Palantir to 0?
Well, it's actually, I didn't say this last night, but now that you're giving me airtime to talk about it again, I had a friend, Dave, who's now retired and he's exited the YouTube community. Hopefully we can get him back, but he left the YouTube community about a year ago. And he saw my transition more from I did talk about this last night as well, my dividend investor specific days to now where I'm at, which is kind of more of a balanced approach and long-term focused aspect of things. So Dave saw that and he was just like, this Palantir company is just like, I just don't, because Dave at the time, he was focusing on, S&P 500 and dividend growth. And he was trying to kind of leave the workforce. He's trying to retire early. So I miss my boy Dave, and he's been avoiding me through DM. So hopefully he's in Thailand or something, getting a massage or something crazy that I would want to do if I was in Thailand now that he's retired. But he would always tell me, he's just like Palantir to 0, and he would just mess with me because he knew it would get me fired up. And so just like anybody else that gets fired up when, people or your friends kind of like try to nudge you or poke you and get a rise out of you, I kind of own the term, right? And then I kind of used it in my own sense, right? Where people will try to almost say, and he didn't think that Palantir was going to 0. I think he actually knew the company. I think he worked in software. And so I think he actually knew that it was going to be a good company. It just, for him, it just didn't fit strategically into his portfolio because it was dividend focused. But now you have people like the folks that are writing the bear cases and that put zero due diligence or something. It'd be like the same as me being like, what's a good one? Enovix. It'd be like the same as me saying Enovix is garbage company.
Right.
I haven't done any freaking research on Enovix, but here you have people just because they want to be relevant in chat, which we talked a little bit about before the podcast and also during the podcast a little bit yesterday on Palantir Weekly. People just bringing names up just so they could be relevant and be in the conversation because, sometimes they want to participate. Sometimes they want to feel relevant. Sometimes they want to, and so they'll bring up conversations just to be involved in the conversation, just so that they're tagged in it and they're referenced and everyone's just trying to grow their platforms. And, you have so many different things up in the air, and to understand why things are the way they are, sometimes people just chat just to say stuff. And so that's when I say Palantir to 0.
It's a sarcastic way to kind of imply that no
one.
one.
And some people like it's a good example. Somebody be like, oh, we think we might be getting the NHS deal. And so, but I thought Palantir was going to 0, right? Like people are always talking trash, right? And so Palantir is always in this news as a spy company, and people just own up and say, yeah, it's a spy company. I agree with the UK. Why would we want to have anything that's associated with US spyware in the UK? And I'll immediately just probably respond with, and Palantir's going to 0. Because at the end of the day, I'm so convicted in the company that I know it's going to be so revolutionary for this particular industry sorry, that's not the right words I wanted to use. Sorry. It's going to be so revolutionary for enterprise, hospitals, warfare, just the West in general. And I said this on a previous podcast, Palantir is trying to save Rome. We are in such a shit show right now in the United States with respect to how data is being kept, from an NSA perspective, from a DoD perspective, so many different archaic infrastructures. It all needs to be revolutionized. And to be very frank, if I'm surprised it hasn't caught on yet, maybe it's just getting there. Maybe the government can just act slower than I think. But if they truly saw the power of having a Palantir Foundry as the operating system for the US government, I mean, imagine how easy it would be to have Apollo be like, okay, this person from the DoD has access to this data, blah 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 blah. It's like, imagine how much easier things could be if the NSA database is the same as the DoD database, is the same as the Army database, is the same as and instead of having all these separate operating systems, it's like, bro, like you're all operating off of, I don't want to say the same data because they're all looking at different objectives, but that goes back to having all the data stored in one place and having the model libraries and the ontology set up appropriately, coupled with Apollo to be able to give people the right access to what sort of characterizations of data, right? So I think that if the US government were smart, I could see it being way more than $8 to $10 billion, but just the way that I'm thinking and how slow it is, it's just going to be a slow grind to get to that point. Maybe maybe it'll get to the point where they're like the entire US government is being run off of Foundry or Gotham. That point, you're talking $50 billion or so more, because
Right.
you're not just talking about the defense budget, you're talking about all the other budgets as well. Housing budgets, welfare budgets, like all that stuff is going to be part of it put into Palantir's pockets at that point. And to be frank, I think it would be the best way to go, just based on what I know versus how I'm sure back end systems are built, and all these different government agencies. But that's what I mean by Palantir to zero. Somebody that hasn't done the research, that it's just like, I thought it was going to zero. Somebody releases a good article. It's like all these great articles that come out as a stepping stone in building the great house that I believe that I believe Palantir will eventually be. And I feel like we haven't even finished the foundation. We haven't even gotten to the first floor. So huge runway. And then tying it back to your AWS question, if you think that Palantir is getting their fingers involved in a lot of stuff right now, I can't wait till 2030 or 2035.
Okay. That's it. That's awesome. That's where we'll leave off. Thank you, Matt. This was great. I think it's going to provide a lot of value to a lot of people who don't know what Palantir is or trying to understand the value proposition of it, especially from someone who uses it every day. It means a lot. Thank you for spending your time with me. And
absolutely. Yeah. Feel free, if anybody has questions, DM me or message me on my YouTube channel. I'll be more than happy to help in any sort of way, shape, or possible. I'm here. As much as I like to talk shit on Twitter, I am here for the community and I love helping people. And if I was truly here for money, I probably would have left a long time ago. I've been making YouTube videos for like 6-7 years. And you don't get a lot of money making YouTube content. Maybe you do, but you do it like 24/7. But I'm sure you feel like this is all I'm getting.
Yeah, it's a grind. It's not something that's not, you got to put up a lot of numbers for getting money.
And consistency. You've been at it for 2 years almost straight. And I'm sure you're like, this is it. But it'll get there to the point where it hits a pivot point and you'll be like, oh shit, all worth it.
If you want to follow Matt on Twitter or on YouTube, links will be in the description. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.
I will talk to you very soon.
Talk to you soon, brother.
Bye.